Imagine a group of soldiers standing in the midst of the Pacific Theater during World War II, communicating in a language so complex, so unique, that even their enemies, despite their best efforts, could never understand it. This wasn't the work of cryptographers with codes written on paper or hidden in machines. No, this was a code spoken by the men themselves, a code rooted in the ancient and intricate Navajo language. In the early 1940s, the United States was struggling with one of the greatest challenges of warfare: secure communication. At a time when the enemy was intercepting radio transmissions and decoding messages with ease, the U.S. military needed something stronger, something that couldn't be broken. The solution came in the form of the Navajo Code Talkers, an elite group of Native American soldiers who used their native language to create a code so impenetrable that it baffled the Japanese throughout the entire war. The Navajo language, with its complex grammar, tonal nuances, and vast vocabulary, was perfect for military codes. But what made it truly unbreakable was the fact that, at the time, very few people in the world spoke Navajo. And of those who did, even fewer understood its intricacies well enough to translate it into something useful for cryptographic purposes. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers began in 1942, when the U.S. Marine Corps was looking for a way to strengthen its communications in the Pacific. The idea was simple. If they could find a language that was virtually unrecognizable to the Japanese, they could send messages that no one would be able to decipher. They quickly turned to the Navajo people, who during the war were living in the American Southwest, many of them having been previously overlooked by the government. 29 Navajo men were selected for the mission, but their role was far from ordinary. They didn't just learn to transmit military messages in their native tongue. They created an entirely new form of communication, translating military terms into words in Navajo that had never existed before. For example, the word for tank became che daga, meaning turtle, and fighter plane became vahu, meaning chicken hawk. The code didn't just rely on spoken Navajo, it relied on Navajo words that were given new meanings to represent specific military terms, making it even harder for anyone to guess. The Marines knew they had something extraordinary on their hands. The Code Talkers' messages were so fast and so secure that they could be transmitted over radio without fear of interception. Unlike traditional encryption methods, which could be broken down over time by experienced code breakers, the Navajo code was fluid and adaptive, constantly evolving with the needs of the military. No one could crack it, and the Japanese certainly didn't stand a chance. But as the Code Talkers began to send encrypted messages during some of the most intense battles in the Pacific, the Japanese began to take notice. Their military intelligence officers, who had cracked many of the Allies' codes, were baffled by the messages they were intercepting. They couldn't make sense of the strings of words, and that's when the first doubts crept in. Could this be a code that could never be broken? Or were the Americans just using some sort of obscure, untranslatable language that wasn't worth their time? For the Japanese, the idea of the U.S. military using a code that could not be deciphered was unsettling. They had relied heavily on their ability to decode enemy communications during the war. But with the advent of the Navajo Code Talkers, they faced a new challenge, one they didn't know how to overcome. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't understand the Navajo language, and the more they tried, the more they realized that their regular tactics for code breaking were useless. But they couldn't just accept that the code was unbreakable. They had to find a way to break it. So they made a fatal mistake. They assumed that because the Navajo code was so alien to them, it was simply a matter of time before they could crack it. And that's where the story of the Japanese officers who recorded the Navajo Code Talkers' voices comes in. The Japanese believed that by analyzing and recording the sound of the Code Talkers' transmissions, they might be able to identify patterns or clues that would allow them to translate the language. What they didn't know was that the Navajo language itself, along with the way it was being used in the code, had been carefully crafted to prevent exactly that. The Japanese officers planned to record the Navajo voices and use language experts to decode the messages, only brought them closer to a dead end. They had no one in their ranks who could even begin to understand the language, much less its cryptographic value. Their attempts to analyze and understand the messages would prove futile. What the Japanese didn't realize, and what would soon become clear to them, was that they had underestimated the genius of the Navajo Code Talkers. As they continued their futile attempts to break the code, the Navajo code talkers continued to serve as one of the most essential elements of the U.S. military's war effort in the Pacific. The code talkers' speed and accuracy in sending messages helped secure victory after victory in the Pacific, from the Battle of Iwo Jima to the Battle of Okinawa. The Navajo code remained unbroken throughout the war, and the men who created it were integral to the success of the U.S. military's campaigns in the Pacific. But while the Navajo code talkers played a crucial role in the war, their contribution remained a secret for many years. The U.S. government kept their work classified until 1968, and it wasn't until decades later that the full extent of their heroism became widely recognized. The Navajo code talkers' legacy lives on as a testament to the power of language, culture, and innovation in wartime. Their work was not just about transmitting messages. It was about using their unique heritage to contribute to the greater good of their country. And in doing so, they proved that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not just the ones that fire bullets or drop bombs, but the ones that communicate across cultures, languages, and histories. As the U.S. military began to deploy the Navajo code talkers across the Pacific, their ability to transmit messages securely and at lightning speed quickly proved invaluable. However, for the Japanese military, something unusual was happening. Despite their best efforts to intercept and decode American communications, they couldn't make sense of the encrypted transmissions that were being broadcast across the Pacific. At first, the Japanese believed that these were simply cryptic messages or ciphers that could be cracked with time and effort. But as weeks turned into months and their attempts continued to fail, the Japanese began to realize that this was no ordinary code. They didn't know what it was, but something about the messages was different. The Japanese intelligence officers, skilled and experienced in the art of code breaking, found themselves completely stumped. Over time, their frustration grew as they tried various methods to crack what they now suspected might be a code. But it wasn't just the peculiar words in the messages that left them perplexed. It was the speed and efficiency with which the Americans were able to send them. The transmissions were swift, and the language used was unlike anything the Japanese had encountered before. Soon, the Japanese military became fixated on one possibility. The Americans weren't using a traditional cipher at all. What if they had come up with a new form of communication? A language that was entirely foreign to them. This theory began to make sense, especially when Japanese officers who had been analyzing the messages noted one curious thing. The speech patterns they were hearing over the airwaves didn't match anything they had encountered in their intelligence reports. There was a tone, a rhythm, that didn't fit within the structure of any foreign languages they had on record. It was almost as if the words were not foreign at all, but deeply rooted in something more native, something that could not be deciphered through standard code-breaking methods. This led to a critical and fatal misunderstanding on the part of the Japanese officers. The Japanese, believing they could still break the code, turned their attention to the idea that the messages were being spoken in a language that they could potentially learn to understand. They began to think that it was just a matter of time before they found a language expert who could make sense of the words. But this assumption would prove to be a fatal mistake. The Japanese officers, in their pursuit of deciphering the messages, failed to realize something crucial. The Navajo language was not a language that could simply be learned or analyzed in a matter of weeks. The intricacies of Navajo grammar, syntax, and its tonal qualities made it one of the most difficult languages in the world to understand. Even if they had access to someone who spoke Navajo fluently, they would still face an insurmountable challenge in trying to decode the messages. To make matters worse, there was no record of the Navajo language within the Japanese intelligence community, and certainly no language experts who could make sense of the words being spoken over the radios. As the Japanese military continued to collect intercepted transmissions, they began to make a serious attempt to understand the structure of the Navajo language itself. They recorded the voices of the code talkers, analyzing the speech patterns and trying to find some common thread that might provide a key to unlocking the code. But the deeper they dug, the more confused they became. The very nature of the language they were hearing over the radio made no sense to them. The words didn't follow any recognizable patterns, and there were no obvious correlations to any language families they had knowledge of. At this point, the Japanese military intelligence officers were left with one option. They needed a native speaker who could explain what the code talkers were saying. But this was easier said than done. Navajo was not a language spoken outside of a small group of native people in the American Southwest, and it had never been documented in a way that would make it possible for someone to learn it quickly. Even the Japanese officers themselves were starting to grasp the difficulty of the task. Their failure to recognize the full scope of the Navajo language's complexity was what would eventually seal their fate. Meanwhile, the code talkers continued their mission with unparalleled effectiveness. They had no idea that their transmissions were being intercepted by the Japanese, nor did they know the extent to which the enemy was trying and failing to break the code. For the Navajo men, their job was simple: transmit messages, stay fast, and stay secure. They didn't know that their actions were contributing to the downfall of the Japanese intelligence efforts. In the heat of battle, while the men of the U.S. Marine Corps fought on the front lines, the code talkers remained in the shadows, their voices carrying crucial information to the right hands. What they didn't know was that their voices, recorded by the enemy, would only confuse and frustrate the Japanese even more. The Japanese military's efforts to crack the Navajo code went on for months, but it was always just beyond their reach. The lack of a native language expert who could understand the Navajo language meant that they were essentially chasing shadows. Even though they realized they were dealing with a native tongue, they couldn't make the leap necessary to fully understand how it was being used in the code. Every time they thought they were getting closer, the code shifted in subtle ways, reinforcing the idea that this was not a code that could simply be cracked through traditional methods. In the end, the Navajo code talkers' language proved to be a brilliant and unbreakable weapon. Not only did the Japanese fail to crack the code, but their belief that it was simply a matter of learning the language only delayed their realization that they were facing an uncrackable cipher. The code talkers' success was built on the assumption that the Japanese would never understand the language, but it was the simplicity of the method that made it so effective. The code talkers were the ultimate expression of using one's heritage as a weapon, combining the power of language with ingenuity and national pride. In the next section, we will delve into how the Japanese never truly understood the significance of the Navajo code talkers and the lasting legacy their work left on military communications. The core brilliance behind the Navajo code talkers was not just their use of the Navajo language itself, but how it was transformed into an entirely new, dynamic code that was almost impossible to crack. While many military codes rely on fixed ciphers, the Navajo code was flexible and context-dependent. It wasn't just a language translation, it was a completely restructured system built on adaptability, cultural nuances, and the complexity of the Navajo tongue itself. This was the true genius of the code talkers and why, despite the Japanese military's extensive efforts, their code was never broken. At its heart, the Navajo code was not simply about translating words into a new language. Instead, each Navajo word represented a specific military term or concept. This redefinition of the language made the code a hybrid of the Navajo language and American military terms, effectively creating an entirely new language. For example, the term fighter plane was translated as vahu, meaning chicken hawk. The word tank was translated to che daga, meaning turtle. Every word in the code had a specific military-related meaning, and no word could stand in isolation. The system relied on the flow of information from one word to another, ensuring that it was impossible to just decode a message using a dictionary or word list. The code wasn't static, it evolved based on the needs of the military, adding new terms and modifying old ones. But the true brilliance of the Navajo code wasn't just in the complexity of the words themselves. The key lay in the code's complete immersion in Navajo culture and syntax, which was completely alien to the Japanese. Native Navajo speakers had a nuanced understanding of their language that few outside their community could grasp. The tonal shifts in the language, combined with the unique sentence structures, made it incredibly difficult for outsiders to decipher. The Japanese military had no hope of cracking the code because they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the language. While their intelligence officers were trained in linguistics and cryptography, Navajo was completely outside their area of expertise. It was an entirely different structure from any language they had encountered, making it impossible for the Japanese to use traditional methods of code breaking. Additionally, The idea that the U.S. military would use a language that only a small number of people could understand was something the Japanese hadn't considered. They had never anticipated that a code could be built around a language that was so foreign and so rooted in a specific cultural context. The Japanese officers' attempts to use recorded voice analysis to crack the code were also doomed to fail. They had no access to a fluent Navajo speaker who could offer insight into the meaning of the code. The language experts they had on hand were entirely unfamiliar with the nuances of Navajo, which meant that no amount of voice recordings, pattern recognition, or decryption techniques would work. The Japanese also failed to recognize that the code talkers did not simply speak Navajo, but had adapted it to suit the military context, making it even more impenetrable. The role of the code talkers was not just to transcribe military orders or to relay battle strategies. They were active participants in combat, working directly with soldiers on the front lines, sending messages under intense pressure. And yet, they did so with the full knowledge that their messages could never be understood by the enemy. Their success in delivering messages quickly and securely was a direct result of the fact that their code was not just a language, but a living system of communication that adapted and evolved based on the needs of the war. The importance of the Navajo code became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. The code talkers were deployed in key battles throughout the Pacific, including Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Battle of Guadalcanal. They were responsible for sending and receiving some of the most important messages of the war, including strategies for amphibious landings and critical intelligence regarding enemy positions. Their speed and accuracy in transmitting messages were vital in giving the U.S. forces a decisive edge over the Japanese. In many cases, messages that would have taken hours to encode and decode using traditional methods were transmitted in minutes. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Navajo code was its sheer speed. While traditional codes and ciphers might take time to decode, the code talkers could send entire messages in a matter of minutes, all while ensuring that the enemy couldn't intercept or decipher them. The speed with which the Navajo code talkers could transmit information was invaluable in a war where time was often of the essence. The precision of their transmissions ensured that the U.S. forces could maintain a constant flow of communication, making it possible to coordinate troop movements, request supplies, and call in air support, often in real time. But the Japanese military didn't just fail to decode the messages, they also underestimated the cultural depth of the Navajo people. The Navajo code talkers weren't just a tool in the war effort, they were soldiers fighting for their country and their heritage. Many of the code talkers came from a background of adversity and struggle, having faced discrimination and prejudice in their own country. Yet, they took on this mission with the knowledge that they were not just fighting for the United States, but for the survival of their culture and language. The success of the Navajo code talkers was as much a triumph of their heritage as it was a victory for the military. The Japanese's persistent failure to crack the code led them to a critical realization. They had been up against something far more formidable than they had anticipated. They weren't just battling a powerful enemy in the U.S. military. They were fighting against a system of communication rooted in a culture that had withstood centuries of oppression. And in the end, that was what made the Navajo code unbreakable. It was more than just a set of words. It was a reflection of the strength and resilience of the Navajo people. As the war in the Pacific raged on, the code talkers' success became a symbol of American ingenuity and determination. By using their native language to protect military secrets, the code talkers provided the U.S. military with an advantage that the Japanese simply couldn't overcome. The Japanese military, with all their intelligence and resources, were no match for the ingenuity of a group of Native American men who had a language all their own. In the next section, we will explore the lasting legacy of the Navajo code talkers and the recognition they received for their contributions to the war effort. Though their work remained classified for decades, their impact on military communication and their role in securing victory in the Pacific is undeniable. For decades after World War II ended, the incredible contributions of the Navajo code talkers remain largely unrecognized by the general public. Despite their pivotal role in ensuring the success of U.S. military campaigns across the Pacific, the code talkers' identities and their unique contribution to the war effort were shrouded in secrecy. For many of the men who served as code talkers, their heroism went uncelebrated, their efforts hidden behind classified military operations and government red tape. In 1968, over 20 years after the end of the war, the truth about the Navajo code talkers began to emerge. After years of secrecy, the U.S. government declassified the role that the Navajo code talkers had played during World War II, allowing these brave men to finally receive the recognition they had long deserved. This declassification came on the heels of a broader effort to honor the contributions of Native Americans in the military, whose sacrifices had often been overlooked by mainstream history. The code talkers' recognition came just in time for many of them to share their stories before they passed away. In 2001, the U.S. Congress awarded the Navajo code talkers the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest honors a civilian can receive in the United States. The ceremony marked the first time that the code talkers had been publicly recognized for their bravery and the extraordinary contributions they made to the war effort. It was a moment of long-awaited vindication for the men who had risked their lives to help secure victories for the Allies while keeping their identities and their work a closely guarded secret. The code talkers' legacy is also reflected in their lasting impact on military communications. The Navajo code may have been confined to the Pacific theater, but its success led to the use of other native languages by the U.S. military in subsequent conflicts. The code talkers' ability to create an unbreakable communication system based on their native language demonstrated the power of cultural and linguistic diversity as a strategic advantage. In fact, during World War II, the U.S. military sought out other Native American languages to create additional codes for different regions of conflict. The ability to communicate securely in a language that was inaccessible to the enemy became a key tactic that proved its value again and again. Perhaps one of the most enduring legacies of the Navajo code talkers is their cultural significance. For the Navajo people, the code talkers were not just soldiers, they were symbols of resilience, pride, and identity. Their work was a reminder of the strength of Native American communities, and their heroism became an important part of the broader narrative of American patriotism. The Navajo code talkers proved that a culture that had faced centuries of oppression could make a monumental impact in shaping the outcome of the largest global conflict the world had ever seen. For generations to come, the code talkers' story has inspired Native Americans, young and old, to take pride in their heritage and culture. Their example serves as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapons in war are not always the ones fired from guns or bombs, but are the ones rooted in language, identity, and a sense of purpose. The Navajo code talkers' contributions transcend military strategy. They symbolize the perseverance of a people who have long been marginalized but who played an undeniable role in securing freedom for others. Despite their critical role in the success of U.S. military operations, the Navajo code talkers were not the only group of Native Americans who made significant contributions to the war effort. Native Americans in general served in large numbers during World War II, with many of them volunteering for the military despite the difficult conditions they faced on reservations. Like the code talkers, many of these individuals went unrecognized for their efforts, and their stories remain largely untold. The Navajo code talkers, however, stand as the most celebrated example of Native American service in the war, and their contributions have helped to shine a light on the broader role that Native Americans played in ensuring victory during World War II. The impact of the Navajo code talkers also extends to the field of cryptography and military intelligence. The success of the code talkers demonstrated the immense value of secure, unbreakable communications in modern warfare. Their work laid the foundation for future innovations in encryption and communications technology that would play crucial roles in subsequent conflicts, including the Cold War and the ongoing fight against terrorism. In essence, the code talkers' ingenuity marked a turning point in the history of military communications, showing that a combination of language and technology could create an insurmountable barrier against enemy intelligence efforts. In recent years, the story of the Navajo code talkers has become more widely known, not only in the United States but around the world. Their story has been immortalized in books, documentaries, and even Hollywood films. Perhaps most notably, the 2002 film Wind Talkers, starring Nicolas Cage, dramatized the role of the Navajo code talkers during World War II. While the film took some artistic liberties, It helped introduce the story of the Code Talkers to a new generation of viewers who may not have been familiar with their contributions to the war. As we look back on the history of the Navajo Code Talkers, it is clear that their contribution was not just a military one, but a cultural and historical one. They were able to leverage their native language, an essential part of their cultural identity, and transform it into a tool of war, a weapon that the Japanese could not break, no matter how hard they tried. In doing so, they not only contributed to the victory of the Allied forces, but also ensured that their language and culture would remain a part of history, preserved and honored for future generations. In conclusion, the Navajo Code Talkers' role in World War II stands as a testament to the power of language, culture, and heritage in shaping history. Their success was based on much more than just their ability to speak a foreign language. It was their resilience, their connection to their roots, and their unwavering determination that made the code unbreakable. Today, we remember them not only for their military service, but for the lasting impact they had on the world, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons in war are the ones spoken from the heart.